My name is Sebastian, and in this video I want to show you how to use AI-generated texts and images in your Quarkus applications. So these AI-generated images were quite popular in the last weeks and months, and what I want to show you is how to use especially this API from OpenAI, where you can create an account, to use these AI models that then can generate some text or some images that we can use actually in our enterprise applications. So how this works is that nowadays a few of these projects offer APIs that we can then use, which is what we're gonna do in this video. So I have a Quarkus application for you, my Quarkus playground, that then should be an enterprise application that should make use of these APIs. So how this works is, well, I have a Quarkus application that uses a fairly recent version of Quarkus and Java, and I include the Quarkus dependencies just to, well, access something via HTTP and JSON. And now what we're going to use, well, we're going to check out this API and see how we can integrate it. So if we have a look at the API reference, and I included some accounts, so I created an account and also an API key to access it. Well, what we can do first is just to have some text completion. So we can, for example, well, have some prompt. So we give it a certain string, send this to the API, and then it will generate or do something with it based on, well, what we ask. So let's try this out. We have some example requests here that we can use, and if we gonna take this example in the documentation and translate it to our Java code, then, well, what this would be is to say we use this API here with our OpenAI API that we're gonna access. So let's try this out in our Quarkus code. I'm gonna create some, let's call this OpenAI client here, where I say I would like to access this somehow, and then let's say I'm going to use Json Array on the client side to access that. So I'm going to have something like a client builder. I'm going to prepare a new client here and say, okay, please access a specific URI. That should be that URI for the text completions, or for these completions here that we're going to have as a target. Always make sure you close your clients and application shutdown here. And then what I'm going to do is to say, well, yeah, please create some text. So let's have the following, that we say generate text based on some prompt. So this is the interesting thing that we're going to have. And then what we're going to do, and you can check out the code example for that, is to say, okay, we're going to send something here. We're going to post to that particular target and say, well, post a particular JSON object. That's what this is. So what is required? Well, not much. You have to use a model. So you can check out the documentation here. We're going to use this one that is there. So basically that. We're going to have to use a prompt to just, or should use a prompt to use that in a specific way. And then, well, you can also say, what would you like to generate, and then interact more with this particular model. So let's try this out. We can say, well, first of all, we would like to have a JSON to create this JSON object to say add. And then let's see what we're going to have. We're going to paste something here. So first of all, we would like to have a specific model. We would like to use this. Then we add our prompt. This now should come from this argument. And then also, well, it depends now what you would like to do. So we can have a look at that, like how many tokens they are. So tokens basically here translates to how much text, or how long this text should be, how many words. And with this, we can also set this, what max token. I would set this now to 64, something like this. And say, okay, this should be our JSON object here, which then we're gonna send to our targets. So this should be application JSON. We're gonna add some header for the authentication in a second. So this should be the authorization header. I use the import from Json Array. We do this in a second, and then we're gonna post a JSON here, which then gives us a response. Okay, so let's try this out first. We say response, read this as a string and see what we get here. And then, well, for these purposes, we can just return that string. That also works. We say, okay, please just return that and move it on as such. Okay, then what do we need to do? I need to invoke this method somehow, and we need to add some authorization. How this works, well, that depends on the API that you're using. So this one shows you it uses a bearer token that you can create. I've done so in my account. And typically in Quarkus, you would use this as a property or as a somewhat configuration value, which we can do here. So I can say, please inject a config property that comes from my properties file. So I can say that should be the secret key for this one that will be added as a bearer token, where I say the header, authorization header would be bearer and the secret key here, and then I can already post this and then see what's happening. Okay, let's do this, but for that, in order to work, I could, for example, include just a simple REST invocation. I think that's the easiest to do. So we can say text generation resource, something like this. Let's say that should be text. We could post something for that, or now just for testing purposes, I say, well, this should just have some get method where this will be invoked. So then we say, well, I would like to use the other client here and say generate text, and then, well, what would we like to have? So for example, we could say generate 5 names with first and surname. So then it will just have some certain names that you can use as a as some test data, for instance. Okay, we could have this, and then let's see if this works. So I'm gonna go and say, well, start up my Quarkus application in Quarkus dev mode, and then once that is up and running, go to texts plural, and then it will invoke this and say, okay, interesting. Now it looks a little bit weird. Why? Because it comes as a JSON output. I just was reading the JSON response, so I need to parse that. But then it basically emits some text here in a way that it says, okay, first John Smith, then Jane Doe, Bill Jones. So, you know, typically random names. And well, let's use this in a little bit nicer way. So if we say we get this JSON response, what are we interested in? Are these choices? You can check this out in the documentation as well. So as a response, you get these choices here. Depends on the number of generations. Now we only have one, so we will have one response here as a text. So that's what we're interested in. For now, we can use JSON-B or JSON-P to map this in our Quarkus application. So now we say instead of this was only a test. We say don't just read the entity as a string, but basically say that should be a JSON object. You could use a record or some other data transfer object structure. So there are multiple options here. I will use a JSON object where we say that should be the JSON object that we return here. Then we get a JSON array that is called choices. So that should be this one. And then we say, well, we're only interested in the first one. That should be a JSON object. And then we can get the string of text. So I think this is correct. We go to this choices that is a JSON array. And then we have text here. Okay, so that should be returned. Let's see if this works. That should be a string. So let's try this out. It always helps to say we're gonna debug this as well. So for example, the toString just of the JSON object here will be printed just for our testing purposes. Now let's try this out again. And then after a short while, we here get our well, names back. So that's quite interesting. Let's do this again. It depends a little bit the structure, because now we're not dealing with some software that has a very deterministic way. So as you can see, this is almost like some array structure here that comes in back here, but that was literally returned from the OpenAI API, which is what we can check out here. So if you want to try this yourself, I encourage you to first of all log what is coming back, just to not get any surprises, because the second time, as you could see, we got this as a sort of list response. So to say, okay, please generate 5 names. Well, it says so, first, second, third, and so on and so forth. In this way, they sound, I think, a little bit more Spanish. Here they sound more, well, English American. Let's try this out one more time. So that's kind of interesting to see, okay, now you get some apparently Harry Potter characters. So that's kind of interesting. So I didn't prepare this. You see every time that comes back differently, and here it even has some padding text as well. So you need to be a little bit more specific what you want to have or what makes sense here. So what we can do is to say, okay, now it could just generate a quote. So for example, to say, well, have a daily quote, something like this, that then we can display in our website, for example. So let's try this out. We can say, well, for example, generate something like a quote from some person. So in this way, we could say, generate quote by the famous writer Lev Tolstoy. Let's try this out. And then we get something back that says, this one, it's not titles that honor man, but man that honor titles. Okay, interesting. So here we see also some interesting structure. So that is also the response in the text. So this kind of interesting what comes back here. You might want to tune this a little bit more, is to say, okay, generate a sentence with a quote like this. Let's try this out. And this looks a little bit better. So let's try this one more time. We see that we have now some sort of quotes or some sort of single sentences. So that's kind of interesting. Let's build this into our Quarkus sort of site. So let's have some template with some HTML, a site that we can generate from that. So we can include this, for example, in text. HTML is to say, okay, this should be today's quote, for instance. Today's quote. And then we have that from the text. And now what we do, we use not a JAX-RS resource, but something like a text generation controller. That should be a controller for our Qt approach. So this is now done a little bit differently. We say that should be text HTML, and that should produce HTML here, where we say get something that would be a template instance for our text that then will be included from the template that we just created. So that would be a Qt template, where then we say, okay, the template should include some data from a text that then should come from, well, what we just created, our OpenAI client. So for example, well, a similar thing that we had here for generate a text that then will be included here. So this is also possible, where we say, okay, now just please go to, well, localhost 8080 and text. So this should be available there. So let's go to the browser and say, okay, this would be available here, localhost 8080 text, and then we get this. So that's already kind of interesting. We now have a website with some quotes. Of course, you want to, well, check out what is happening here. And also you want to be careful with your requests, because obviously now you're going to use the API. And here with OpenAPI, it works in such a way that then this will account for what you use in your account there. So if you say, well, you have a specific usage there over time, that then just shows, okay, how much free trial credits are you using and how much is being used there. So that's not what I just used. I've been trying this out today a few times, but which is what we can check out in a second. I will use the image API in a second as well. But for now, that's already interesting. We can have some quotes here. Obviously, you could batch generate some and then store them and then show them in your application and things like that. But from a client perspective, that is how we can interact with the API. Okay, now let's do the same with images. That's also very interesting, maybe even more interesting. So we can check out the API reference and then see, okay, how to create an image. So this is probably what is even more popular or famous from these OpenAI perspectives. So we can see, well, can we use this here as well? So let's try that in our application. Let's say, okay, go back to this client and say, instead of just to generate a text, we can say, well, generate an image. And how this works, I wrote string here. Well, you will get actually a URI back from a specific prompt. So where I say, okay, well, do a similar thing. So actually we can, first of all, for now I can copy and paste this, but for a different target. So this now would be the text completions target. And then we have a separate one that would be an image completions or image generations. So this is called /images/generations. That's what we're going to do here. Generations. And then with this, we're going to save this as a different target here as well. And then for a generate image method, we're going to use that as well. So we're going to use the image generations target in a similar way. We're going to post JSON entity here. And then for the response, what we're going to do, that is just having a slightly different response here. We gonna need to read this differently. We do this in a second. So how does the request look like? We have images generations, and then for the request body, let's see, in the documentation, it just says, well, prompt and then size and n, well, number of generations. We only want to have one. Let's try this out. Add. Okay, we have the prompt, which should come from our method. Then n should be 1, and the size should be, well, that's actually a nice size. Let's do this for now. Okay, so we're going to do that. We're going to generate it from a prompt, and then let's have a look at the response here as well. How does this look like? Well, we get a JSON response with data, and then so and so many images. We only have one, so one JSON object with URL. So that looks actually quite similar to what we had. Get JSON array for data, and then a JSON object where then we say the first one, get the string from URL, and that should be the URL that we return. So a JSON array, let's check this one more time. Data, correct, that's an array, and then there is an object with URL inside. Okay, perfect. So let's do this, and then let's try out the generate image. So that it's easier for us, we already include this in a controller that returns HTML. So I'm gonna copy and paste this. We say that should be a second controller, an image generation controller, that now we call image HTML with a new template. I'm gonna create in a second, and we call this image. And here we say, well, generate an image. And then we call this, for example, photo of a smiling corgi, of a smiling dog. Okay, so that's that. We can have this generate image. That is now not the text, but the URL. We're going to include this as the image URL. And then, of course, I need to create that template. So that's image HTML. So that's today's dog image. And we're going to have that as a source. So as an image, image source. For then we say, okay, that will be the URL. So that should work. We included the URL in our controller. So let's try it out. If this works, I'm going to include this. That will be image HTML. I go to image HTML. Let's try that. And now the image generation takes a little bit longer. You will see this. So here it obviously makes sense to sort of have that either in the background or then, to process it in a way where this doesn't go in the way. And now we have some image that we just auto-generated, well, by invoking this API. We can do this again. So of course, then now you have to be careful because every request will create a request to this OpenAI API and then also use up your credits. But that makes sense maybe to just say, well, you would like to process this in another way in the background and then store these URLs, and then you can access them. Or of course, you could also go and download the image to store it there, to have less traffic, and to have it on your own content network. So let's change this photo of a smiling, let's say golden retriever, so another dog, and then you can have this here as well. So I think that's kind of interesting to use these APIs. And well, if you're a Java developer, you can use any Java API to access that as well. And then you can, play around and have fun. And I tried it now a few times. It's really fun to play around with these APIs, and you don't need to use their website. You can use your own applications once you have access, to Java code, and once you can use their API. And here I showed you how to use this with Java and with Quarkus, and by accessing this API to make use of these AI generations for text and images. I hope this was, interesting to watch, maybe fun to watch, and maybe it inspired you to play around with that as well. As always, you can check out the code on GitHub. And if you enjoyed this, I would really appreciate a like. So thanks a lot for watching.